The Endeavour hummed with the quiet, rhythmic pulse of its engines as it crossed the last charted quadrant of space. Dr. Elaine Morrison sat in the observation deck, staring at the inky void beyond. It was a strange kind of darkness, different from the familiar blackness of deep space. No stars glittered here. No distant galaxies formed pinpricks of light. It was absolute, suffocating, as though the universe itself ended just beyond the ship's reach. "Are you seeing this?" she asked over the intercom, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I see it," Viktor Tarasov replied from the engineering bay. "But I don't like it. Instruments are picking up nothing. Not empty space, Elaine. Actual nothingness. No matter. No energy. Just void." Elaine leaned forward, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't answer him. Instead, her mind raced with calculations, theories. The Great Silence was supposed to be a myth, a speculative edge of the universe where physics broke down. Now, it was right in front of them. The comm crackled again. "Dr. Morrison, you should come to the lab," said Hannah Kwan, the mission's biologist. "We're picking up something strange." Elaine reluctantly tore herself away from the observation window and made her way to the lab. The corridors were eerily quiet, the usual hum of systems dampened, as though the ship itself was uneasy. When she entered, Hannah and Marcus Hale, the mission pilot, were hunched over a console. "We started receiving this an hour ago," Hannah said, pointing to a series of jagged waveforms on the screen. The signals were faint but distinct, repeating at irregular intervals. "It's not just static, it's a pattern." "Could be a natural phenomenon," Elaine suggested. "Gamma bursts, maybe." Marcus shook his head. "That's what I thought at first, but then we ran it through the linguistics module." He tapped a key and the console translated the signal into text. Words scrolled across the screen. Fragmented, garbled, but undeniably purposeful. "Turn back. Do not cross. It lives here." Elaine felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Alien transmissions. That's impossible. We're beyond any known civilization." "Impossible or not, it's what we've got," Hannah said, her voice taut with unease. "And the messages are getting stronger the closer we get." Elaine leaned over the console, studying the data. "If this is a warning, we can't ignore it. We have to find out what's sending it." Marcus frowned. "Find out?" "Elaine, that sounds like the exact opposite of what we should do." Elaine straightened, her expression resolute. "We didn't come all this way to stop at the first sign of trouble. We're scientists. Exploration is our job." Victor's voice cut in over the comm, his Russian accent sharper than usual. "Elaine, I've got something you need to see. The ship's systems are detecting a gravitational anomaly. It's pulling us toward the boundary." Elaine exchanged a glance with Hannah and Marcus before hurrying to the engineering bay. The gravitational anomaly was unlike anything they'd encountered, an invisible force tugging at the Endeavour with increasing strength. The ship's automated systems fought to maintain course, but the boundary loomed closer with every passing second. The void at the edge of the universe wasn't empty, Elaine realized. It was alive with something unseen, something powerful enough to warp the laws of physics. Her scientific curiosity burned, even as her instincts screamed to turn back. "Elaine," Victor said quietly. "We're playing with forces we don't understand. Maybe those warnings aren't just noise." She didn't answer. Instead, she made her way back to the observation deck, where the boundary was now impossibly close. It shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising from pavement, but with no visible source of light. The darkness beyond seemed to ripple, as though it were breathing. As the ship breached the boundary, a low vibration resonated through the hull, more felt than heard. Elaine gripped the edge of her console as her vision blurred. Around her, the walls seemed to stretch and pulse, as though the ship itself were alive. Then the first signal hit. It wasn't a transmission, it was a presence, a visceral awareness that wrapped around the ship like a predator sizing up its prey. The warning messages intensified, flooding the comm systems in a cacophony of alien voices. "Turn back. Do not cross. It lives here." The ship's lights flickered, and Elaine's chest tightened as the full weight of their situation settled over her. This wasn't just an edge. They had crossed into something else entirely, something that was waiting for them. The Endeavour drifted in the boundary's unnatural stillness. No stars, no galaxies, no discernible time or space, just the oppressive living void surrounding the ship like an infinite predator. Inside, tension gripped the crew as they worked to regain control of their systems. Elaine stood in the lab, her eyes fixed on the translucent, pulsating mass suspended in a containment field. "We shouldn't have taken a sample," Marcus muttered from the doorway, his face pale as he glanced at the gelatinous form. "You saw what happened when we crossed the boundary. We're not equipped to deal with whatever this is." Hannah ignored him, her focus on the data streaming across her monitor. "It's cellular, but unlike anything I've ever seen. It replicates rapidly, but its structure is wrong, not like any biology we know. And it's responding to the ship, Elaine. It's adapting." "Adapting how?" Elaine asked, her voice sharper than intended. She didn't want to admit it, but the alien sample unnerved her in a way she couldn't rationalize. Hannah gestured to the screen, where the mass's internal structure pulsed in sync with the ship's vibrations. "It's mimicking our systems, replicating energy patterns, almost like it's learning." Victor's voice crackled over the intercom. "We've got bigger problems. The engines are down again, and the anomaly is pulling us deeper. I don't think we're in control anymore." Elaine glanced at Marcus, who was already on his way to help Victor. She turned back to Hannah. "Keep monitoring it, but don't take any unnecessary risks. If it becomes unstable, we jettison it." Hannah nodded, though her brow furrowed with worry. "Elaine, this thing, it's not just alive, it's aware." Hours later, Elaine was in the control room with Marcus and Victor, reviewing the ship's worsening condition. The gravitational anomaly had locked them in place, and the ship's systems were faltering under the strain. The void outside seemed to press against the hull, warping the metal in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Then came the scream. Elaine bolted toward the lab, Marcus and Victor close behind her. Inside, the containment field was shattered, and Hannah was sprawled on the floor, her arm held tightly by a writhing tendril of the alien mass. The gelatinous creature had expanded, its translucent body now veined with dark, pulsating lines that throbbed like arteries. "Cut it off!" Hannah screamed, thrashing as the tendril burrowed under her skin. Black veins spiderwebbed from the wound, creeping toward her shoulder. Victor grabbed a laser scalpel and severed the tendril, but the damage was already done. Hannah convulsed, her body racked with spasms as the alien infection spread. Elaine knelt beside her, frantically scanning her vitals. The monitor beeped erratically, displaying readings that made no biological sense. "It's taking over," Hannah gasped, her voice trembling with fear. "You have to kill it." Before Elaine could respond, Hannah's body jerked violently. Her skin stretched and tore as the infection twisted her into something unrecognizable. Her chest split open, revealing a gaping maw filled with needle-like teeth. Her limbs elongated, bones cracking audibly as they reconfigured themselves. Marcus dragged Elaine back as the creature that had once been Hannah rose to its feet, its glowing eyes fixating on them with predatory intent. It let out a guttural, inhuman screech before lunging at Victor. "Run!" Victor shouted, grabbing a steel pipe to defend himself. Elaine and Marcus bolted out of the lab, the sounds of metal clanging and Victor's shouts echoing behind them. They sealed the lab doors just as the creature slammed into the reinforced glass, its teeth gnashing as it clawed at the barrier. Elaine stared in horror, her mind reeling. "Is that going to happen to all of us?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elaine didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the creature's distorted form. It wasn't just Hannah anymore. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As they returned to the control room, the ship's lights flickered ominously. The entity wasn't just inside Hannah, it was in the ship itself. The mass had infiltrated the systems, spreading like a virus. The gravity felt heavier, the air thicker, as though the Endeavour was being suffocated from within. Elaine sank into her chair, her mind racing for solutions. "We need to isolate the contamination. If it spreads to the engines or life support, we're finished." "And what about Victor?" Marcus demanded. "He's still in there with that thing." Elaine hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Before she could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. It was Victor's voice, weak but determined. "Elaine, don't come back for me. Seal the lab. Contain it." "No," Elaine said, standing abruptly. "We can find a way to—" "You can't," Victor interrupted, coughing violently. "I can feel it already. It's in me too. Just promise me you'll destroy this thing. Don't let it leave this ship." The intercom cut out, and Elaine knew there was no time to argue. With trembling hands, she activated the emergency lockdown protocol, sealing the lab permanently. As the doors locked with a deafening hiss, Elaine leaned against the console, her breath shaky. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Somewhere deep in the ship, the alien mass pulsed with sinister intent, its growth unstoppable. They had crossed the edge of the universe, and now the entity had awakened. The ship was dying. Elaine could feel it as she gripped the edge of the console in the control room. The air was heavier now, carrying a faint, acrid smell that burned her throat. Lights flickered erratically, casting the walls in a strobe of shadow and brightness. Somewhere deep within the ship, the alien entity was spreading, fusing with their systems, warping the Endeavour into something unrecognizable. "We're losing containment in more sections," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Whatever that thing is, it's learning. It's adapting to our technology." Elaine stared at the displays, each one flashing red warnings. Life support systems were unstable, and parts of the hull showed biological anomalies, growths of the same veined, gelatinous material that had consumed Hannah. The ship groaned, a sound that no longer seemed mechanical. It was deeper, wetter, like the groan of some massive living creature. "Can we still move?" Elaine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Marcus shook his head. "The engines are completely compromised. Whatever it's doing to the ship, it's merging with it. If we don't find a way to stop it, there won't be a ship left." Elaine turned to him. "We need to sever the infection. If we can isolate the entity to one section." A loud metallic screech interrupted her, followed by a deep, resonating thud. Both of them froze as the sound reverberated through the walls. The ship's lights dimmed again, plunging them into near darkness before emergency illumination flickered on. "It's coming," Marcus whispered. Elaine swallowed hard. "We need to get to engineering. If we can overload the core, we might be able to destroy it, or at least buy ourselves some time." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Together they moved through the dim corridors, their steps echoing ominously. The ship felt smaller now, its familiar design distorted. Bulkheads seemed to twist and pulsate, the walls coated with a thin layer of the alien substance. It glistened under the flickering lights, veins pulsing faintly as if alive. The comm system crackled, startling them. A garbled voice came through, barely audible over the static. It took a moment for Elaine to recognize it. It was Victor. "Elaine." "Marcus." His voice was strained, choked with pain. "Don't come near engineering. It's too late." Elaine grabbed the nearest intercom panel. "Victor, are you alive? What's happening down there?" There was a pause, punctuated by labored breathing. Then his voice returned, weaker. "It's not just the ship. It's in me. I can feel it. My body's not my own anymore." Elaine's stomach turned as she imagined what had happened to him. Victor had been exposed when the creature escaped containment. If it had infected him the way it had Hannah. "You need to get off this ship," Victor continued, his voice breaking. "You need to—" He stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, guttural growl, then silence. Elaine and Marcus exchanged a grim look. Neither spoke as they continued toward engineering, though the growing sense of dread hung between them like a physical weight. When they reached the entrance, they stopped short. The door was partially open, warped and bulging with alien material. Beyond it, the engineering bay was unrecognizable. The walls, floors, and ceiling were coated in the pulsating mass. Tendrils hung from above, twitching as if sensing their presence. And in the center of the room stood Victor, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and grotesque, his limbs elongated and fused with the mass. His face was barely human, his eyes glowing faintly, like dim embers in a dying fire. He turned slowly toward them, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Elaine." The voice that emerged from the creature's mouth was a distorted echo of Victor's, layered with an inhuman undertone. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The unity, the perfection." Elaine took a step back, her heart pounding. "Victor, we can help you." "There's no Victor," it interrupted, its voice cold and alien. "Only the whole, and soon you will be part of it." The creature lunged, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Marcus shoved Elaine aside, barely avoiding the tendrils that shot toward them. He fired his sidearm, the rounds tearing into the mass but having little effect. "Run!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Elaine by the arm and dragging her away. They sprinted through the corridors, the sound of wet, slapping footsteps close behind. The ship seemed to warp around them, the walls closing in, veins spreading like wildfire. The air was thick with a nauseating organic stench. "We can't outrun it," Marcus gasped, pulling her into a side passage. "If we can't kill it, we have to stop it from spreading." Elaine's mind raced. The core, the ship's reactor. It was the only way. If they could overload it, they could destroy the Endeavour and everything on it. But it would be a death sentence. She met Marcus's gaze, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. "We have to blow the core." He nodded, grim but resolute. "Then let's do it." The path to the reactor was a nightmare. The alien mass had overtaken nearly everything, and the deeper they went, the more it felt like walking into the belly of a living creature. Flesh-like growths lined the walls, pulsating with every step. Strange organic sounds filled the air, wet squelches, deep groans, and the occasional distant shriek. By the time they reached the reactor, Elaine could barely breathe. The control panels were partially covered in the alien material, but they were still functional. Marcus began inputting the override sequence while Elaine set the core to overload. As she worked, the mass began to stir. Tendrils slithered toward them, and from the shadows emerged the creature that had been Victor. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring their terror. "You can't stop it," it said, its voice a sick mockery of Victor's. "You're already part of it. Just let go." Elaine ignored it, her fingers flying across the console. The core's alarms blared, signaling the countdown to detonation. Marcus stepped between her and the creature, his sidearm raised. "Go to hell," he muttered, firing until the clip was empty. The creature lunged at him, its tendrils piercing his chest and lifting him off the ground. He cried out, blood pouring from his mouth, but he managed to turn his head toward Elaine. "Finish it," he gasped. Elaine hesitated, tears streaming down her face before hitting the final command. The core began its overload sequence, the ship shaking violently as energy built to critical levels. The last thing Elaine saw before the explosion was the creature's glowing eyes, filled not with malice but with a twisted sense of inevitability, as if it knew it had already won. The Endeavour burned. The reactor's overload ignited the ship in a cataclysmic burst of light and heat, tearing through the alien mass that had consumed it. Elaine should have died in the explosion. She expected to. But as the fire engulfed her, she felt something else entirely. Time stretched. The world around her unraveled into fragments of memory, sound, and sensation. She wasn't disintegrating. She was dissolving, her very essence pulled apart and absorbed into something vast, endless, and alive. The pain was unbearable at first, her mind fighting against the alien force that invaded it. But then, slowly, the fight ebbed. The struggle gave way to understanding. She wasn't dying. She was being consumed. Her thoughts became disjointed, her memories bleeding together. She saw flashes of her life, her first day at the academy, her father's lectures about the stars, the day she received her mission orders for the Endeavour. And then the memories twisted, blending with others that weren't her own. Alien landscapes, civilizations built from living stone, and faces, countless faces, etched in terror as they too were absorbed. "We warned you." The voices came from everywhere and nowhere, a cacophony of languages and tones that spoke in unison. Elaine floated in the void, surrounded by the echoes of countless lives, each one trapped in the same endless cycle. The creature wasn't just a predator, it was a collector. She was no longer alone. Millions of consciousnesses swirled around her, each one fragmented and distorted, their individuality crushed under the weight of the whole. They weren't speaking to her. They were screaming, their collective agony reverberating through her mind. Elaine tried to focus, to cling to some shred of herself, but the entity pushed back. It flooded her with its will, showing her what she had failed to see before. The boundary of the universe wasn't a border, it was a prison. The void wasn't emptiness, it was a cage. And the creature, it was the Warden. She understood now why the warnings had come. The civilizations that had sent them weren't trying to keep her out. They were trying to keep the entity in. Humanity's curiosity had done what those civilizations had feared. It had opened the door. Elaine's awareness expanded as the creature fully enveloped her. She saw the universe not as a human, but as it did. Endless, fragile, ripe for assimilation. It was not evil. It was hunger incarnate, its existence defined by the need to grow, to consume, to merge. And now, through her, it had a new perspective. Through her memories, it had learned of Earth. Elaine. The voice was faint, almost drowned in the cacophony, but she recognized it. Marcus, or what was left of him. His presence flickered weakly in the void, a dim light struggling against the pull of the entity. "You're still here, aren't you?" she asked, her thoughts barely forming into coherence. "Not much left of me," he replied, his voice tinged with sorrow, "but enough to regret. We shouldn't have come here, Elaine. We've damned everyone." The weight of his words crushed her, but she refused to give in completely. There had to be something she could do, some way to stop the entity before it reached Earth. But how? She was nothing now, a speck in an ocean of consciousness. Then she remembered the warnings. They had been sent out not by those the creature had consumed, but by those who had escaped. Those who had resisted, even at the cost of their civilizations. They had left a message behind. Maybe she could too. Elaine focused every ounce of her will on her memories of the Endeavour, the boundary, the creature's form. She compressed her thoughts into a single coherent idea, a warning to anyone who might follow. She couldn't destroy the creature, but she could make sure no one else would set it free. It fought her, of course. The entity lashed out, flooding her with visions of oblivion, of the futility of resistance. But she clung to her humanity, to the stubborn streak that had led her to push past the boundary in the first place. She was a scientist, an explorer, and now a messenger. With a final surge of effort, she released her warning into the void. the message scattered into the fabric of the universe, carried by the same currents that had brought her here. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left to give. The entity, enraged by her defiance, pressed down on her consciousness until there was nothing left of Elaine Morrison except fragments, echoes, whispers in the dark. Somewhere, in a distant galaxy, a ship received the warning. The crew, explorers like Elaine, stared at the translated message in silence. Turn back. Do not cross. It lives here. The captain hesitated, their hand hovering over the controls. Curiosity burned in their eyes, but so did fear. The decision hung in the balance, and in the void the entity waited. It had all the time in the universe. It always did.